Hey, welcome back to Selects with Sika. That was Mysterious Skin. And before we get into our discussion with Taylor, I just wanted to bring up some trivia that I found. One, Emil Hirsch originally auditioned for the role of Neil, but they decided to go with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, which I think is a better choice. Gregg Araki, the director, edited this whole film using Final Cut Pro 4, which is 7 years old. It's less than what we have here in the media studies department, so that's kind of cool to me. And then also, in order to protect the kids that are acting in the film, he actually wrote sort of a smaller miniature script for them and didn't really tell them what the entire movie was about. They basically went off of, in this scene, you're going to act like this. So I thought that was pretty cool and pretty clever for him, too. So like I said, we're with Taylor here, going to be discussing Mysterious Skin. How are you, Taylor?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. I'm just great. You're a UNCG student. What's your major?
I'm majoring in psychology and I'm minoring in women and gender studies.
Cool. That's my minor too. So we actually watched this movie together last night.
Mm-hmm.
So what were your first impressions?
I was really impressed with the way they filmed it because of the script you were talking about. It seemed like because it's about such a heavy topic, I liked that the children weren't really put into harm for the sake of the movie.
Right. But in general, you had a positive.
Yeah, I really liked it.
Yeah, me too. So like you said, it does deal with a really heavy subject, but I think that the way that it's dealt with is actually pretty light. There's no really cliche serious Oscar moments, where someone breaks down crying or something like that, where it feels like you're being forced to feel sorry for these people. It's kind of realistic and light, like life is. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there are a lot of things about it that seemed sort of surreal. It was just sort of weird to watch, which made it almost comical. So, I don't know, I think they probably did that so it's easier to watch because it is about a heavy topic.
Right, exactly, for the audience to cope with with the subject. Yeah, I think a lot of what goes into that sort of surreality, I guess would be the word, would be the music, for instance. I think that's what a lot of people notice. Because you have this sort of 15-second scene at the beginning where it's just music and you see the falling cereal.
Right.
And so I think like scenes like that, for instance, help with that feeling of nostalgia, of memory, of things being surreal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah. Plus Gregg Araki, I mean, as I said, like I'm a really big fan of him, and he's always said that he's more influenced by music than he is by other films. And so I think, especially for this film, where it has so much to do with emotions, obviously, like the plot is a huge thing, but whether you can relate to that specific event or not, you still get that emotional feel from it either way because of the music, I think. And like you said, there's things that are surreal in it that almost make it comical. And I know, like, one thing, especially when I first watched it, is with the UFO at the beginning.
Yeah.
Where, you have this memory, and whereas usually you might see, like, a light or something and think, oh, okay, this isn't real. We know that that's not his real memory. You actually see the UFO like he would have remembered it. And I think that really, like, locks in the idea where you're not sure whether you can count on this narrator, on the validness of on the validity of his memory.
Yeah, right when that was happening, I was confused for a moment because I was like, wait, is this the right movie?
Right.
Because it was weird that it was happening. And so I also think it sort of put you in almost a childlike state because it is about child abuse. So maybe it's trying to make the audience sort of feel that innocence for themselves.
Right, and I think, I mean, if we're talking about things being surreal, like so much of what the movie is about has to do with memory.
Right.
And when you are a child, you definitely romanticize things that happen, whether they're good or bad things. And I think the actual movie goes from that point of view. I mean, you're literally in the cameras in the point of view of the child most of the time. And then eventually it moves on through time and it gets a little bit more realistic. It gets grittier. The colors get less, have less of that little golden haze over things. And so I think like even the aesthetics really connect to that motif of memory and, a child's point of view.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And speaking of going back to the whole UFO thing, I know as we were talking, we sort of brought out a lot. There's a lot about space in this movie, both literally and figuratively. Obviously, Brian thinks that he's been abducted by aliens.
Right.
But also there's the line that you pointed out to me that where Wendy says that, or I think it's Eric that says that Neil is a planet and planets don't write letters. I guess could you talk about that a little bit? Because you were the one that...
Yeah. Well, he said that Neil is a planet and that we're all just the moon circling around him. And so the reason Brian hadn't gotten a response yet is because planets don't write letters. And so I think that the point of that was also that the audience is just the moons that are orbiting around Neil. He's sort of untouchable because his point of view about what happened to him is completely different than what most people would feel about it. Most people would think that it was horrible and completely negative. But Neil definitely romanticized it, and he feels that he almost had a positive experience with what happened.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, when you talk about like the audience being moons that orbit around Neil, I mean, Neil, other than in the narration, you really don't hear him talk about what happened. He goes through these encounters with all the different Johns, but he never actually confronts what's happening until the end.
Right.
Even when he does, like he brings it up to Wendy, but it's still in that romanticized way where you can see that he is emotionally stuck in that same moment over and over and over and reliving it and trying to get back to Kansas after he's already gone to New York, for instance.
Yeah, because he even tells her that most people would think that it was horrible, but it's just something that happened. So instead of being like this horrible event, it's just a normal thing to him.
Right.
Which is very weird.
Right. Or even a positive thing. Like he refers to the coach as his one true love, and he always talks about how he feels like he was his favorite. He feels like he was special and things like that.
Yeah.
And I know because you're a psychology major. Do you have anything to sort of bring to us about why that is, how someone could view it like that? Or on the flip side with Brian, who completely, his memory is completely warped because of this really traumatic event that happened.
A really important thing to remember is that people cope in different ways. So for Neil, he was looking for love and acceptance, and he found that in the coach. But Brian, because he couldn't really face what happened to him, he completely shut everything out to the point where he thought that he had been abducted by aliens. So for Neil, it was that he wanted to belong to someone, and he found that in the coach. That's why he kept bringing up that he was the coach's favorite. He felt like he saved the bedroom for them, that sort of thing. Neil just wanted to feel loved, and so whenever he was with his Johns, you could tell from the first one, he thought about the cereal falling again when he was with the coach, because he wanted to be brought back to that moment to where he felt accepted.
Right, exactly. And then when he actually has an encounter where, the guy only wants a back rub, basically. Right. And he actually has to be there and care for someone, then he kind of can't deal with it. For the first time, he's really upset by this encounter because he doesn't, I think the thing with Neil is that he doesn't really realize what healthy sexual behavior is.
Right.
I mean, he's sexually acting out, but it's in a very dysfunctional way.
To the point where sex is desensitized to him. Right. So he can perform these sex acts and that's fine, but when he's actually supposed to give a genuine just like manifestation of just caring for someone, that's too much for him. Right. The emotion is much horrible than the physical act.
Right. And while we're talking about the sexuality depicted in the film, I thought it was interesting. I've been looking up I've been doing some research on this film, and I found that there was this big controversy when it first came out in Australia, with a group called the Australian Family Association. It's a fundamentalist group, and they're basically saying that this movie taught sexual predators how to go about finding victims and things like that. And I found it really interesting because I think the movie actually does the opposite. I mean, other than the fact that you're always in the point of view of the victim, I don't think at any point in the movie it makes it seem like a romantic thing or like something that's positive. And I think it's one of the few movies that actually is very clear about sexuality. Like we were talking about the issue of consent, which I think in a lot of movies, especially mainstream Hollywood movies, is not really talked about. It's not really something that people seem to find necessary. But like you were talking, for instance, about sex workers and how a lot of people, they might be sexually assaulted, but they think, oh, because this person was turning tricks or whatever, that's automatically consent. And I think this movie is very clear about the fact that that's not true.
Yeah, it's definitely important to remember that they're not selling their bodies, they're selling an act. So when Neil was older and he was raped by one of the Johns, you can see how emotional he was, because he didn't give consent. The interesting thing is that even though he was abused when he was a child, he felt love and trust with his abuser, and he didn't give him the ability to consent. Then of course he couldn't because he's a child, so he doesn't have the ability to give consent. But he told him, don't ever let anyone tell you that this is wrong. So he completely shut off his ability to give consent right then. And then whenever he was older, the guy beat him into submission, basically.
Right, exactly. And I think also you bring up the point about Neil as a child, obviously not enjoying this, but maybe being confused at the time, or because one thing that I think is really interesting or different and maybe controversial about this film is that when Neil first sees the coach, and he's I think 8 years old, he's immediately attracted to him. And I think that in a lot of films, it's very black and white. It's very much, like I'm getting a creepy feeling from this older man, and that's not necessarily how it always happens. And I think it just drives home that point that even if someone, especially a child, is sexually curious about something, that does not give you the right to obviously violate them. Also, the point with the fact that Neil later is gay, I think a lot of people sort of see this movie as feeding into that whole stereotype of, well, all gay men have been sexually violated at one point in their life. That's the cause of their sexual orientation. When actually we see, again, that Neil was gay before this happened to him. And I think it's really good for that reason.
Yeah, I thought that was a really important thing that they did.
I know you said there's a statistic from the APA about...
Well, a lot of people say that also that gay men are more likely to abuse children, but that's not the case. 60% of child abusers or child sexual abusers are known to the kids, but they're not family members. And most abusers are male, but they are equally hetero and homosexual.
Right, which I think is interesting, and I think it connects with some research that I was doing today from the National Center for Victims of Crime, and they were talking about how for the abuser it has nothing to do with sexual desire, because that's not what rape is about. It's not about sex, it's about power. And so basically they seek out victims that they view as more easily accessible, not necessarily because of their age, because of their gender, because of whatever.
Yeah, child abusers definitely look for someone who's vulnerable, which Neil and Brian both were. Neil was vulnerable because his mother was always gone and his father wasn't in the picture, and Brian was vulnerable that night because he didn't have anyone to pick him up. and they go through a cycle where they get them to trust them and love them, and they show them how that they care for them, and then they abuse them, tell them that it's okay, that what happened wasn't wrong, and that they liked it, and then the cycle just keeps continuing.
Right. I think the interesting thing about this film is that, I mean, it's set in Kansas, which I was reading some interviews with the guy Scott Heim, who wrote the novel that it's based on. And he was talking about how, you know, he grew up in Kansas, and a lot of people would think of it as this really secure place. And in the movie as well, a lot of the characters are saying, you know, well, this is Kansas, this is safe, it's okay. You know, like, you don't have to have safe sex here and stuff. People like that aren't here. But I think that in Kansas, I mean, it's a very vast place, and it's a small town that they live in, but it's more private, right? It starts off in the cellar with Brian in the cellar, and then it ends in the coach's home. So you have a lot of these private places, whereas when Neil goes to New York, it's kind of like there's no room for that privacy.
Yeah, that was really interesting because, you know, they kept saying you'll be safe in Kansas, but the initial abuse that happened was in Kansas.
Right.
So.
And I think, I mean, I was just thinking about, for some reason this just popped into my head, but The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
You know, like, that's set in Kansas, and it's kind of, you know, you go back to Kansas, and that's like the safe place, that's home sweet home, which is obviously turned on its head in this story.
Yeah, and I think that also goes back to his abuse. I mean, whenever he was in New York, he said, I hated Kansas, I never want to go back there, but it's a safe place. It's all I've ever known. So I do want to go back there for a little bit. And so I think that that's a reflective of his abuse. I don't think that he enjoyed it, but it's all he's ever known. So that's the emotional state that he keeps going back to.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think I really wanted to talk about this film, though, because, well, obviously because I love it, I think it's an important topic, but also because it happens to be Sexual Health Awareness Week. That's why there's been so many events on campus this week, you know, talking about sexual health, and obviously I think a big part of sexual health is mental health as well as the physical part, and I think that this film definitely has that element in it in a proper way. I have a quote here from Scott Heim, and he's talking about the ending of the film. First of all, what did you think of the ending?
I really liked it because I think it felt real. You know, Neil, you can hear him saying, well, I'd like to tell him that it would get better, but I don't want to lie. Right. Just like he keeps flashing back to his abuse, I think that that's always going to happen. They're both always going to go back to it because it's all they've ever known. And it can never really leave them. But the fact that they found each other and they got to talk about what happened, I think that could help.
Right. Right. And Scott Heim basically touches on that too. He says, I didn't want there to be some sort of Hollywood ending where you think, oh, they're fine again. Now they'll go on and live better lives or something. I don't think anything's ever that simple or black and white. But I did want there to be some sort of feeling of redemption at the end, and I think Gregg did such a great job of doing what I hope I tried to do with the book, which I think he accomplished, and I think it ties into what you were just saying with, you know, it's not about, okay, now they're going to live happily ever after. I think really the point of it is confronting truth and seeing things as they are, or at least as much as you can, which is why I chose this film, and which is why for the rest of the films that I'm going to choose, I really just want to choose movies that I think are honest, and I think maybe talk about truths that maybe we already know but just don't think about very much, because I think that's the point of good film. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So with that said, the next film that we're going to be talking about is Style Wars, which is a 1983 documentary termed the essential document for graffiti and hip-hop, which I think is pretty awesome. And that's Style Wars, not Star Wars. So if you want to be a guest on the show and talk to me about films, or you have a suggestion for a movie you want us to talk about, email spartantv@gmail.com. This is Selects with Sika. Thank you, Taylor, for talking to me today.
Thank you.
And good night.